dot back then could bring as much as 400, but today it would be much closer to $40,000. So obviously times have changed. The Firebird 3 reverse body, $425, which would bring over 10,000 now. And Fender Broadcaster, which we put at 49, but we know better now. We know now we wouldn't say that there was any 49 Broadcaster. It would be 1950, but it was $1,000, where today a really nice Broadcaster certainly could push $100,000. And the 58 Precision bass for 450, well, you know, that would certainly, a good one should bring over $15,000. So, and the 58 Stratocaster for $450, again, you're going to have to add quite a bit to that to, you know, that the prices obviously have gone such that if we only had the time machine to go back, that would be great. But you know, Stromberg Deluxe for $750 today would bring at least $25,000 for a nice one. And prices have changed. So I'm not going to go through every single price here, except to say that it's pretty amazing to see what happened in 1937 Super 400 Gibson mint condition, $950, whereas today 37 mint one would bring more like 25,000 or a bit more. So things have changed, and things are going to continue to change, but probably not necessarily at the same rate. But the problem is, back then, I didn't have something back then that I have now. And right now, see, here we have the crystal ball. And let's see what looking through the crystal ball might tell us. And we've seen before, I think, that if you hold something straight up to the crystal ball, bingo, it's right side up and magnified. But if you look at the crystal ball or something through a slight distance, what you see is the world is upside down. So the problem is we don't know what the future holds. But we do know that we have hindsight over a period of years, and we can say that prices have continued to fluctuate over the years, but it's been extremely difficult at times to predict. There are times when prices go up at a very rapid rate, which they were during the 70s, but primarily from 70 through 75, they were going up at a rapid rate, and then it slowed down dramatically. The baby boomers were dropping out, and Generation X was less interested. And actually prices from 76 through the mid 80s stagnated and didn't even keep up with inflation, whereas throughout the 60s and into the 70s through 75, prices were going up at a rapid rate. And then we've seen a period from 2002 through 2006 when prices went absolutely nuts. They went up, sometimes tenfold in a short time. And then after 2008, the economy had a marked crash and prices went down dramatically. But for the most part, they've recovered at this point. Although banjos and lower sign mandolins, F5s, are down from their peak right now. But again, I can't tell you what they're going to be 5 years or 10 years from now. What I can tell you is that in hindsight, there's a whole bunch of things on that early 70s list that I wish I could go back and grab now, or that if I'd known then what I know now, I'd have kept them and just had them as a great nest egg. But we don't always have the luxury of being able to do that. In fact, we really never have the luxury of doing that. We don't know the future. If you were to go to your stockbroker and ask how much Apple or Microsoft stock or Facebook stock or Tesla stock is going to be worth in 5 years, they'd look at you like you're crazy. How are they supposed to know? They'll try to make short-term predictions. And in the short term, what I can say is right now, guitars have been doing surprisingly well, especially in the last year. Vintage and used guitar sales are very strong. The banjo and mandolin sales less so, but still they're not plunging. But the guitar sales are doing just fine. And many guitar prices now are significantly stronger, higher than they were 2 or 3 years ago. And companies like Martin, Gibson, Fender, et cetera, are having difficulty keeping up with the demand. And we're having difficulty getting enough good vintage instruments. But where that will lead in the long run is much more difficult to say. You have this handy. I have another thing I'd like to talk about and put on the screen for you. And it is a full-page advertisement that was in Liberty magazine, dated November 15, 1930. And it's an interesting commentary on what happens in technology and how it can affect the music market and numerous other markets. But this one, The Robot's Lullaby, you'll notice there's a metal robot with a steam shovel jaw holding a baby rattle, except it's got a big $sign on it, crying baby, the audience of the future. And on the robot's apron, canned music in theaters. Gee, I wonder what that means. Let's read it and see. And what's become of the songs my mother taught me, murmurs the infant, stirring from a nightmare. I don't like this new nurse at all, and I want my really truly mother back again. Shall the soothing, refreshing inspiration of living music be superseded in our theaters by the shoddy substitute of mechanical reproductions? Music lovers by the millions are saying no to this preposterous imposition. The Music Defense League has grown amazingly during the past few weeks. Now it's your turn to join your neighbors in rescuing the sacred art of music from machine-made debasement by signing this coupon today. And this is from the American Federation of Musicians, the Musicians Union. Well, what had happened in such that in 1930, they were so upset what had put hundreds of thousands of musicians, many of whom were members of the Musicians Union, out of work, or at least out of a good portion of their work. What were the theaters they were talking about? Well, if you go back only 5 years prior to 1930, in 1925, radio was a pretty new thing. It really wasn't around much, but radio did develop the ability to have electronic microphones and an amplifier for the radio, so that the earliest radios were crystal sets and you could listen to them with headphones. But then later, by the mid-20s, they were coming out with radios that had an amplifier and speakers, and you could plug it in the wall and you could fill a room with sound. And that meant that the amplifier had been invented. And it also meant that they came up with the idea that electronically, maybe sound could be added to movies and later yet to instruments. But what was happening in this ad was that the talking movie had been introduced. The first talking movie, The Jazz Singer, had the so-called Vitaphone system that synchronized a sound recording sort of with the screen, but it was not all that great. It didn't have the sound track directly on the film. If you look at a movie film, you'll see it has a little section. It has the regular movie frames, and then it has beside it, it has a little squiggly area that is actually something that can be read with light, but converts it to soundtrack, and that's totally synchronized. The jazz singer only had about 3 minutes of sound, and it was singing where they didn't have to get the lip syncing as perfect as in a movie. But what happened at any rate was that talking movies had put all those musicians who played for silent movies out of work, because the silent movies really weren't silent. They came with sheet music. And some musicians could even just improvise. They could watch the screen and play something interesting to go along with the action. But the point is, the difference between a cheap theater and a better theater was how good a sound you provided in many cases. If it was somebody at an upright piano that was barely in tune and not paying attention to what's happening on the screen, that might be a cheap theater. But a better theater might have a duo or a trio or a quartet or even a full orchestra. And in a fine theater, the full orchestra was great, but it still didn't provide talking. It provided, though, a dramatic entertainment background. And people went to the movies even more so than today, because back then radio was new, TV didn't exist. And one of the major sources of entertainment, even in small towns, was to go to the movies. And in the larger towns, they'd have multiple theaters. And in the big cities, they sure enough had theaters, everything from pretty funky ones on up to very deluxe. You could have a fine full-size symphony orchestra accompanying the movie. At any rate, that advertisement was that every musician who was accompanying movies was immediately out of work as soon as the movies had soundtracks. It didn't matter how good a musician you were. But the next thing that happened was that amplifiers had been invented for not only radios, but bigger, more powerful ones for the theaters. This gave musicians and musical instrument makers ideas, because it occurred to them that amplifiers could amplify musical instruments. Nobody was going to invent an electric guitar prior to the amplifier. And the amplifiers were developed by the radio industry, and that technology spread rapidly to the theaters, but that technology also spread within a very short time to musical instruments. As early as 1924, Lloyd Loar, when he was associated with Gibson, was experimenting with electric guitar amplification, but he had very crude electrostatic pickups, not magnetic. The first magnetic pickup was patented by George Beecham. He had been affiliated with National and also with Rickenbacker, and that resulted soon after in the association with Beecham and Rickenbacker with the frying pan lap steel, the electro steel. And that was introduced as early as 32. So it took very little time for that technology to spread. Gibson was doing an electric lap steel in 1935, and they were also doing electric Spanish neck guitars as early as 35, recording King brand for Montgomery Ward. So Rickenbacker and Gibson were both doing electrics very early, and the technology spread rapidly. Leo Fender, during World War II, had a radio repair shop. During the war, there was rationing, and you could not get a radio, you couldn't get a civilian car, and even musical instruments were strictly rationed on how much metal content they could have. And during the war, there were no electric guitars being made, but Leo started out repairing radios. And also he became familiar with the theater systems for amplification. Shortly after the war, he and Doc Kaufman started K&F. They produced amplifiers and lap steels. And not long after that, the Broadcaster came out as the first solid body electric, commercially successful electric. There were others earlier, such as Audiovox in the 30s in Seattle did electric fretted basses and solid body guitars and made amps. They weren't all that great in quality, but they did certainly exist. And Rickenbacker had produced a Bakelite solid body guitar, round neck, as early as 36. Point is, Leo Fender was the first one, though, to make an amplifier that would just kick butt. And that is what it would take to make solid body electrics really successful. And it was a very short step there after that technology not only created new opportunities for musicians, but it also did a lot to kill the big band era. If you were a club owner with a dance hall that you wanted to fill and you charged a certain amount for ticket price to get in, and you also served drinks, if you had a choice of hiring a 30-piece orchestra with a conductor and a complete entourage, and you had to feed them and house them and everything else, that was very expensive. But if you just hire a 4-piece combo with an electric guitar, an electric bass, maybe a lap steel or a non-pedal steel, electric keyboard, drums, you know, you could do a 4 or 5-piece group. And the young kids liked it. The ones in their teens and 20s and even into the 30s, they took to that new music and they liked it. And all of a sudden, the big band era was over. And a lot of the musicians who were great at the big band music didn't really adapt very well to new music, the electronic music. They had their own feelings about it. Today, a lot of studios find it's hard to compete, aside from the fact that we have a pandemic. You know, you can, for a small amount of money, have more recording power than Elvis or even the Beatles ever had. And you can have a home studio. You don't need to do demos in a professional studio anymore. So that's another change that happens. But technology has been putting some people out of work and putting others into work and changing the work environment for as long as there has been technological change. So technological change, you can go back a millennium and see changes, and we know that it's going on today. But there's hardly been any time when technology influenced what happened with musical instrument making and performing more than what was happening in the early 30s through on into the 50s. The changes in musical instrument design and in the styles of music possible, and in just what it was like to be a musician, where you worked, how you worked, and what it was like to run a club. Yeah, if you were running a dance hall and you were making your money on ticket price and alcohol sales, that 4 or 5-piece combo is very appealing. So anyway, we'll plod on to other things. Plenty of reader and listener questions. JR says, I had a question for George regarding manufacturing supply chain challenging and resulting product scarcity. Does he see this problem continuing past 2021? And if so, how will it affect brands, manufacture, and price, and also prices of products? Will there be less product and higher prices? Well, right now, it is kind of tough out there. Companies like Martin and Gibson are back ordered. Collings is severely back ordered. But the demand is there. Fender claims that they had a great year that they had record volume, so they've been able to produce. Certainly, I know that Taylor is chugging away just fine, and there may be problems, but do I anticipate dramatically higher prices? No. I think that manufacturers know that it's not in their best interest to hit everybody with a huge price hike. And they're doing their best to get production back online as quick as possible after the pandemic problems. And overall, I anticipate that supply will be a bit tight this year, but that's not going to be a permanent situation, and that prices will hold reasonably steady, and that quality is continuing to be good. Mike C says Rickenbackers don't get mentioned a lot. What's your opinion of Rickenbacker guitars, and what years would you consider to be Rickenbacker's golden era? It seems Rickenbacker guitars hold their value very well on the used market. I would say that their golden era was during the 1950s through the mid 1960s, but that they continue to make good quality guitars. Rickenbackers are noted for a sort of jangly sound, and they are typically not a musician's only guitar. They're sort of part of an arsenal, and they can produce sounds that are distinctly different from a Gibson or a Fender, which is one reason why, for example, George Harrison liked to use, and John Lennon too, Rickenbacker guitars for especially their 12 strings, but not as their exclusive only guitar. But musicians can have access to more than one sound, and the Rickenbacker sound is distinctively different. But if there was any period when Rickenbackers were really selling very well and were seen very prominently on stage with many really top name bands, then that period of the early and mid 60s with the Beatles, the Byrds, and really quite a few other groups, Rickenbackers, and especially the Rickenbacker 12 strings, were getting a lot of attention. Rickenbacker still today tends to be back ordered, but unlike some of the other companies that expanded tremendously, Rickenbacker stayed pretty small. So even in times when the market is down, Rickenbacker has never been in a position of suffering greatly from a downturn because they always were back ordered. So they just had fewer back orders than when they were in the midst of a market boom, but they were in a position where they didn't really take advantage of the market boom because they didn't make enough to ever fill the demand. So even when it went down, they were okay. Frank says, I have a question relative to Norland era Gibson Les Pauls. Can you discuss the differences between earlier models and those built since the early 90s and more recently? It's just that most of the 1970s Gibson guitars I've owned and played lacked the craftsmanship versus other periods. Also, the finish in this period guitar seems to have changed with copious amounts on many guitars I've seen. Well, basically, I agree with the 70s when Norland was still running Gibson, when had just acquired it, they cheapened the product. They cut the quality. Norland acquired Gibson in 1970 and quality suffered. But Norland sold to Henry Juskowitz and his partners in '86. And under Henry, at least some quality items improved. He did some things I wouldn't agree with. And there were things like the Firebird X that I thought was a miserable failure. But so it might have been a bit of a checkered history, but overall, there were still many things done during that period when Juskowitz and cohorts ran it that some of the quality improved significantly. And they also added greatly to the line in doing acoustic guitars in Bozeman, whereas when Norland acquired the company, they still at that point were in Kalamazoo. The Nashville factory didn't open until '74. And then in '84, the Kalamazoo factory closed. So by the time Henry and his partners got Gibson in '86, Nashville was the location for Gibson. And they had quite a job turning things around. It was a shell of what it had once been, but they got it on the cheap, and they did quite a remarkable turnaround. They did some things I may not agree with, but they did a lot of things that did indeed turn that company around and get it back on track. And the new owners, well, it remains to be seen, but they haven't been at the helm very long yet, but they have put a lot of effort and money into rearranging and just basically they're working on a lot of new models. They're working on some new tooling. They are paying attention. We'll see where it goes. So I think it's too early to pass judgment, but I can at least say that under Gibson's present management, the company does seem to be on track to make good stuff. And I'll just leave it at that for now. Bill says I have a 50th anniversary custom Martin quadruple O from the Nashville shop. Well, we only have a Nashville store, but the guitar was made in Nazareth, Pennsylvania. And Gruhn Guitars has one location, and I'm sitting in it. And we're at 2120 8th Avenue South. But Bill says he'd like to hear the backstory of selecting the wood sets at the Martin factory and how that took place. Well, my Martin representative, the local sales rep who lives only about 2 miles down the road from me, but represents 6 different states for Martin as a salesperson, used to work at Martin as a wood buyer. So he was very much instrumental in turning Martin onto the sinker mahogany wood that has been very good for us on a variety of models that we've been having custom made to our specs by Martin for us. And I went to the factory with Jay to design, I had already designed a set of guitars that I wanted made as 50th anniversary models for Gruhn Guitars. And 2020 was the 50th anniversary. And because we were founded in 1970. And we selected the wood at the factory, and the pandemic hit, and some of the production was slowed down. And so we didn't do as big a marketing push as we would otherwise have done. So we still now are selling the 50th anniversary models, which to me it's not that critical whether it's 50th anniversary or whatever it is, they're good guitars. And I just happen to have one right here easily in reach. And this is a 14 fret quadruple O. 16 inches wide. It has abalone top trim, fancy snowflake fingerboard inlays, and very deluxe abalone and pearl peghead inlay. And this is sinker mahogany with very nice figured grain. This is wood that was harvested in Belize when they were logging in that area from about 1880 through 1920. The top is non-torrified Adirondack spruce. Torrification is oven baking, but while it is touted as giving a vintage tone, In my opinion, it gives a lesser harmonic response, but it is definitely physically more brittle, and it doesn't sound the same. And I prefer the sound of non-torified, which to me gives a sweeter, mellower, and more full spectrum harmonic sound. The quadruple O size is a 16-inch guitar that there was no pre-World War II guitar in that size, but there was indeed a precedent for it, and you can see it right up there. This is a 1935 Gibson F7 archtop F-hole guitar. You'll note it's built just like a flat top guitar, except it has an F-hole top and an archtop design bridge, an archtop style pickguard and tailpiece. And it is the exact same body shape as that quadruple O, or what Martin has on some models called an M size. It's basically the same shape as Martin's triple O, except that it's 16 inches wide, so it's a big guitar. And there were a number of players who felt that that would make a very interesting conversion to a flat top. And back in the late 60s, Matt Yeomanoff in New York converted an F7 like this to flat top, and that's the guitar that David Bromberg played extensively and talked Martin into finally doing a flat top guitar in this size in the late 70s. That resulted in the M36 and M38 models. But what we have done is take this body shape and do it in a variety of models, but not built like the M36, which has a three-piece back and a Sitka spruce top. But we've done Adirondack spruce, forward shifted scallop bracing, sinker mahogany, and recently we've come out with some rosewood models as well. But that is the origin of the idea for doing the quadruple O size, or what Martin can call an M, but on the custom models, we are calling it a quadruple O. So there's Martin single O, double O, triple O, and quadruple O. This is the bigger one. That seems the logical model designation. On almost all Martin models, the 14 fret guitars had a 12 fret predecessor. And the 12 fret Martins have a body that's 2 frets longer. The scale length from nut to saddle is the same on the 12 fret and 14 fret version, but here is a 12 fret quadruple O. This is a new design that we just got in. This is the second one we've received. This has a well-figured Indian rosewood back and sides. It's kind of hard with all the light reflections, but you can, at the right angle, you can see it has nicely figured Indian rosewood. And our general findings are that Indian rosewood sounds every bit as good as any Madagascar, Cocobolo, Guatemalan, or Honduran rosewood, and frankly, can give Brazilian a real run for the money if the guitar otherwise is a great instrument. Pre-World War II advanced jumbo Gibsons are Indian rosewood back and sides. And the rosewood 12 fret quad is a size that actually never existed historically for Martin, because the F7 up there was introduced along with an F1, F2, and an F9 in 1935. And since it was introduced in 35, there had been no previous 12-fret flat top in that size. So Martin didn't have a body form to do this size. And it took quite a bit of talking over a period of a couple of years before I got Martin to agree to do this type guitar. But, we did them first in mahogany, and this is one of the very first that we have that just arrived of style 28 with herringbone trim, zigzag back stripe on the back of the guitar. And so far, we ordered 10 of them in sunburst like that and 10 in natural. We've received 2 sunbursts. One of the sunbursts is sold, and the other one, the one you just looked at, it's mine. I'm going to keep that one. But we have more coming, so we'll have 8 more sunbursts and 10 naturals coming. And as soon as we run low on those, I'll reorder them, because it's a model that is strictly limited in production to exactly however many we want to order. So there will be more. But anyway, that's some thoughts on some new developments. Okay. Over. We have question. Stephen says, I'm curious to know why pre-CBS Fenders and 1950s era Gibsons command such high prices. I can understand golden era Martins, wood no longer available, craftsmanship, tonal qualities, scarcity, but Fenders and Gibsons of the 1950s were basically production line instruments and number in the thousands. With the advent of effects and amp settings, isn't it possible to achieve the same tonal quality of the vintage electrics with custom shop electrics of today? Well, first, I can say that humans designed the originals. Humans made the originals. It was handwork and machine work. The quality of machines available today is every bit as good as the quality of machines available in the 1950s. And in many cases, obviously, there are machines that can do things that no machine available in the 50s could do. Computer numeric controlled equipment can produce instruments to very fine standards of quality, so far as meticulously getting dimensions to within 1,000th of an inch from one to another. But they don't have the element of human judgment, so far as on, especially on acoustics, how thick to cut a brace or to tap on a piece of wood and decide how thick to cut it or whether to use that piece at all. But the pickups of the 50s were hand wound, and they had alloys that typically were not designed for the musical instrument industry, but they still were good for what we needed. It may have been pure coincidence, but when Leo Fender bought magnets, he was buying commercial available type magnets rather than having special alloys made to his specs. And much of the technology was, again, developed in other industries. The musical instrument industry didn't really get very deep into metallurgy. The musical instrument industry didn't develop tubes, but the quality of tubes that were available for amplifiers in the 1950s was extremely good, because that was the state-of-the-art technology in the day. After transistors came out, most major industries abandoned tubes. Tubes were temperamental, they were expensive to make, they got hot, they consumed a great deal of energy, and they were fragile, and they could distort. But the distortion that they do actually happens to sound great on electric guitars. And the finest guitar amps, by most people's opinion, are those with tubes in them. So electric guitar makers of the 50s were using the technology and the materials of the times. Good quality, well-seasoned wood was much more readily available in the 50s than it is today. They had workers who had considerable degree of hand working experience. Today, a lot of folks know basically how to operate a machine, but not as many do good hand work, although that's not a dead art. There are still people who know how to do it well. And the fact is that there are new electric guitars made right now that are very good. And in previous shows, I've shown Gruhn model electrics that I designed that Paul Beard is making for us. They're plenty fine. And I think they stack up very well as vintage instruments. There's a certain magic in the old Les Pauls and in the early pre-CBS Fenders. It's hard to beat. And for the really right ones, they still have a sound that I've never heard beaten and rarely ever equaled. It's perhaps subjective, especially now in a day when so many people are performing with so much more equipment than before. I still remember vividly seeing Buddy Guy play at the University of Chicago when he could walk from his car to the stage with everything he was going to use in one trip. 410 Bassman amp in one hand, Fender Strat in a tweed case in the other hand. He probably bought them both in pawn shops on the south side of Chicago and paid no more than $100 each for them, if even that much. But he had a guitar, a chord, and an amp, and that was it. There was no mic in front of the amp. It didn't go through a PA. And in a 1,500 seat hall, that's his rig. And the other guys in the band didn't have anything any fancier than that. And when you had that rig, those Fender amps were good sounding. They were great quality tubes, hard to buy tubes as good as that now. They were fine quality speakers. They were state of the art for what was available at the time, and what was available then was good. And there were also microphones that were good. Those even Neumann mics made in pre-World War II are great mics, and certainly the ones later are also very, very fine mics. Excellent microphones were available a good long time ago. So is it impossible to build a guitar to the same standards of quality as in the 50s? Of course it's possible. Most folks just aren't doing it, but a skilled builder can do a great guitar now, acoustic or electric. And there are more good luthiers now than ever before, but have they, in my opinion, beaten the sound of a pre-CBS Fender or a good Ted McCarty era Gibson electric with patent applied for humbucking pickups? I'd have to say a 1959 Burst is still something that some of the finest electric players in the world prefer over anything else. Now, I'm personally not much of an electric player, but I can say that they do sound great. And I do remember what they sounded like even in the 50s and 60s, but I'm personally collecting guitars since 63. And I still remember listening to a 1966 Fender Strat, brand pretty well new, and comparing it head on with a 64 model, played through the same amp at the same time, because we just put the two together and tried, and it was night and day difference. The CBS era Fender did not sound anywhere near as good as the 1964 Fender. And 64 was the last year in which Leo was really right there at the factory, fully involved. 65, early in the year in January, he sold the company to CBS, and he was no longer at the helm the way he had been, nor was his management staff quite the same either. So he didn't personally do everything. But the point is, times have changed, but there are still some very good guitars being made right now. In the early 1970s and late 60s, even though those old guitars were not really all that old yet, they were so different from the new ones that we knew the difference. And people wanted a pre-CBS Fender, and they wanted a real Les Paul, and that's back when I started out collecting. There were no new Les Pauls. You could get a used one, or that was it. There were no new ones, but the old ones were great. And they sounded way better than the new Gibsons available in the mid-60s and late 60s. So yes, you can still make good guitars. But it's, as to why do they command such high prices, it's not only because they're good, it's they're collectible. And there are some instruments that bring big money, not only because of quality, but they can be scarce and really, really good. And that does justify a high price. I don't feel that I have to sit around trying to justify why do instruments cost what they do, and why do people pay tens of millions or even over $100 million for a Van Gogh painting. And as there are Picasso paintings now that are also hitting that range. By comparison, the guitars are a screaming bargain, and they're actually every bit as rare or more so. I remember going to a museum, art museum in Essen, Germany, back, it's been over 25 years ago, but still they had a whole room filled with Van Goghs. And Essen is basically a factory, working class city. It's not like going to Milan or Rome or Paris, but still, even in a town like that, they had a whole room full of Van Goghs that were definitely real. And people don't question whether art should bring a lot of money. Well, guitars can be every bit as collectible, every bit as rare. And a good guitar is appreciated, you can appreciate it on so many different levels. It's visually beautiful. They have a great sense of aesthetics on the good ones. But they also feel good. They're comfortable to play, and they actually, there's a sensual good feel to them. And they sound good. And they have soul and personality, such that the same guitar played by different musicians will sound different because it brings out, different musicians have a different touch, different sense of aesthetics. The guitar will speak to them. And the really great musicians, when bonded with a great instrument, discover that they become a partnership. And it's, the great guitars don't feel just like an inanimate tool. They feel alive, and they make suggestions. And they can give you ideas you might not have otherwise had. And you might feel like there's new tunes in them. And if you play one and get bored with it after a while, you don't hear any more new tunes. If you stick it back in the closet and pick up another one, and you may discover it has new tunes. If you leave it for a year or so and come back to the other one, while it's been in the closet, it regenerates new tunes again because there's a certain newness to it. But the point is, great musicians inspire artists, player artists, and great musical instruments are in themselves great works of art. They are beautiful visually. You can view it like a painting, but you can also appreciate it the way you would a piece of sculpture. It's three-dimensional. But the sculpture and the painting doesn't produce sound. So you can hear a guitar or a banjo or a mandolin or a violin or other instrument, but also it's interactive. You, if you know how and are trained to do it, and practice, you can play it and interact with it. And so it can be appreciated artistically on all of those levels. You can create with it. It's interactive. You can't do interactive, creative activities with painting or a piece of sculpture. You can do something with a piece of sculpture. I mean, if it's been cases, or even with a banjo, there's a case of a guy who murdered his wife with a banjo. It took 2 banjos to do it. He broke the first one enough, he finished the job with the second banjo. But that's not what banjos are intended for. You can do the same thing with a piece of sculpture. It would be harder to do it with a painting. They're more fragile. They wouldn't serve as a weapon. But the point is, instruments can be appreciated on so many different levels. They're inspirational. And inspirational craftsmen and musicians are not extinct. They're still out there. But the great instruments, just like great art, classic era instruments, can be some of the most wonderfully gorgeous pieces in every way, visually, tactily, sonically, and being inspiring to play and having soul and personality, something that's hard to beat. So John asks, how do you feel about neck shims on bolt-on guitars like Fenders? On the vintage stuff, did they typically come from the factory with a shim? What did they use? Well, they actually often did come with a shim, and they had their own composite material shims that they used. But just adjusting neck angle on those guitars, one is the shape of the neck pocket, and the neck fits in that and bolts in, but also you can adjust it with shims. Taylor has, their current guitars have necks that are fastened with shims in place that can be adjusted, different height shims that they even supply to set action at different heights depending on where you want it, or also to adjust for changes that may happen in winter versus summer humidity. So humidity changes the time of year, at least depending on where you live. But typically in the winter, with heat in a house, the air gets drier and you need to humidify, but even then, you may need to adjust the instrument a bit to feel like you're used to. Summer versus winter changes. Or if you play in a place where you live in a place that's relatively humid and you're a professional musician and you get a gig in Telluride, Colorado, up in the mountains, you discover, wow, it's dry there. And the guitar that played just perfectly when you were at home all of a sudden is out of adjustment. And on instruments that are adjustable, that's handy to be able to do that. But I wouldn't put a shim in a Martin to adjust the action, but they don't have a neck that bolts on either. But the guitars that have bolt-on necks, that's a perfectly accepted and standard way for adjusting neck angle. You have several type settings you can do. You can also adjust bridge height. But the point is there's multiple adjustments you can do, and knowing how to do it and which ones to do to get the optimum result is a bit of an art in itself. Roger says, I have a 1980 super real Greco Les Paul and find the workmanship to be equal to many American-made Les Pauls. Well, the Greco model was made in Japan, Fuji Gengaki, and it didn't say Les Paul on it. But it is true that in the 70s and into the 80s, they did make some Greco brand that were sold in Japan in the domestic market. They had another brand, Gaban, G-A-B-A-N, and the lettering logo font was exactly like Gibson, and you have to look really careful to see it said Gaban and not Gibson. Those were sold in Japan and not in the US, but I remember seeing them in 1974 when I went to Japan and went to a trade show there. Their workmanship was remarkably good, and actually was probably every bit as good, if not better, than a 1974 Gibson. But 1974 was not Gibson's golden era. But still, they were respectable, good guitars that could be played on stage. They were not super cheap. They were made for the Japanese domestic market, and they were too expensive to be worth trying to import into the USA, and it would have run into difficulties with US trademark law. They were copied too close. Tokai also did very close copies of Fenders and Gibsons. And into the 70s and 80s, some of the Tokai electric guitars were remarkably good quality. And Tokai, as well as Fujigen, were making copies of vintage instruments often before the American makers did. And one of the things I think that really inspired Fender to make the new vintage series starting in the mid-80s was that they were responding to the pretty obvious threat they saw in the Tokai guitars and other Japanese instruments. So it didn't take Fender very long to respond by coming out with their own vintage series. But the quality of some of the domestic market Tokai and Fujigen instruments was extremely good, but much of that was not distributed in the USA. Thomas Van Tilburg says, with regard to Gibson Electric L5, was there a golden era for this guitar? Do you think that the current L5 electrics are equally fine? Well, I think the golden era for electric L5s was probably in the 1950s. The earliest L5 electrics had P90 pickups, and they went to the L-nickel 5 pickup with the same staple magnets that you see on the Gibson Les Paul custom models in the neck position that up until mid-57 when they came out with humbuckers. And then after that, the electric L5 and the Super 400 and the Birdland went to patent applied for humbucking pickups, and they had patent applied for pickups into early 62. And then in 62 and into 63, even into early 63, they had enough gold-plated PAF pickups around that quite a few of them, even into early 63, still have patent applied for pickups. And those are really great guitars. I think if I was to say that was there ever a golden era for an electric L5, that it was in the 50s. But is the new one good? Yeah, it is. Is it better than the 1970s one? Yes, it is. So Gibson today is quite capable of making good guitars. They cost a lot, but they are good. And so far as that, the vintage original with PAF pickups also costs a lot. So but the point is, you get good new usable guitars. You don't have to get a vintage guitar to be playable on stage anymore. Back in the 70s, it was generally considered by me and plenty of other musicians that if you wanted a really good electric guitar, you just had to get an old one because the new ones weren't very good. And pretty much the same can be said for acoustics. And some of the Gibson acoustics of the early and mid 70s were absolutely horrifically bad. But that's simply that's what it means. At any rate, Charles Dennison, what do the letters and numbers mean on my new 0014F Sinker Mahogany FG? Well, that's Martin's nomenclature, which we don't actually use, but that's what is on the box. But that's the nomenclature. It's a 000 size body, but it has OM scale, so we're calling that one an OM. 14F, that's 14 fret model. So it's a 14 fret neck and sinker mahogany. And anyway, we have that. These are custom shop models made for us by Martin. And Martin has their own internal house code for what they call things, but they don't stamp that model on the neck block because if it's not a catalog standard model, they don't stamp it on it. But at any rate, what you're describing, there's triple O. We also have quadruple O, 14 fret and quadruple O 12 fret. And I've already shown you today a 14 fret quadruple O size 50th anniversary model and a 12 fret quadruple O size style 28 ornamentation with Indian rosewood back and sides and Adirondack spruce top. And that particular 12 fretter is good enough. I'm keeping it. There's some that's a model is one that I'm particularly happy with. Kent Holland has a question. I have a 1967 Baldwin D 5-string banjo. Finish is really checked. In your opinion, would it be a good idea to have it refinished? Will it affect tone? Well, will it affect tone? Probably not much, because on a banjo, it's not going to be as sensitive being refinished as an acoustic guitar. Will it be cost effective to have it done? Probably not. Is it going to increase the value of the instrument? No. Unless the finish is just plain horrible condition, I would not recommend refinishing it. The 67 Baldwin is actually old enough to have a certain degree of collector's item appeal. In fact, one of the best banjo session guys back in those days in Nashville, Bobby Thompson, now departed, but he was played a Baldwin D, and it was a fine banjo, and he did very well with it. It's a good enough banjo to take on stage and use professionally. It won't bring the money of a pre-World War II flathead Gibson master tone, but it is a good banjo. And I would leave it original. I do whatever is needed to put it in good playing order, but I would not recommend refinishing it. You would actually reduce its value and you'd be spending money to do it. Wayne Lyle says, what do you think about recent news I've been seeing online about Fender Strats not being made from the same wood anymore? So it is somewhere online this week. How will that affect prices between old and new? Well, Fender's not using swamp ash on some models now. And going to alder ash is getting increasingly harder to get, more expensive, and there's also an ash borer beetle that's destroying a lot of forests. But so far as on the recent guitars, I don't think it's going to make a dramatic difference on the price, and certainly on custom shop models, they haven't shifted the wood on that. You can still get the woods of your choice there. So on the production standard line guitars where they've done some changes in the wood, I think that they're still maintaining quality very well. And I personally am not especially upset about what they've done. Brian Ricker This is a question a lot relating to Martin. What were some of the changes concerning guitar building, North Street facility versus present place? Well, the North Street plant goes back many, many years and is a relatively small building. So that's a building that was built, well, that was a good old days building. That's where Martins were made in their golden era of the 1920s and 30s. That was all stuff at the Martin North Street plant. In fact, it was where Martin was until the very late 60s when the present factory was built, and then the present factory has been expanded over the years as well. But the North Street factory had far fewer people, was a much smaller facility, wasn't really set up where they could turn out more than about 6,500 instruments a year. Whereas the new facility can turn out multiples more. The North Street factory had basically the technology that would have been the same as they would have had pre-World War II, pretty much. It did not have modern, certainly no computer numeric controlled equipment or anything of that sort, but more hand work. But the interesting thing is that the quality today at Martin is still remarkably good. The techniques are different. You visit the factory, and you can also visit, they still give tours of the North Street factory. They've kept it sort of as a museum. But it's amazing that they could do as much as they did in a place that was as funky as that was. It was quite primitive, but it still got the job done. And a great deal of hand work, but the basic manufacturing processes are quite different now. But the basic design of the Martin guitar is remarkably consistent over the years. But it is true, some operations have more machine work than in the past, but there's still a tremendous amount of hand work that goes into a Martin. There's a lot of the operations that are not mechanized. And a lot of the critical work is still very much involved with hand work. But the North Street factory is historically interesting. I wouldn't want to have to work in that building. The new building is probably a lot more pleasant environment. It's certainly hugely bigger, and it's capable of far better humidity and temperature control. The North Street factory had no built-in humidity control systems. And so that's an area in which the new factory is better tooled up, more spacious, better working conditions, much better environmental control, extremely more sophisticated equipment. But still, those golden era Martins were made there on North Street. And they weren't producing anywhere remotely near as many instruments per year. Hardly ever more than about 6,500 a year in that facility, and often less. But they were good. And the fact is, though, the new Martins are still good. And I'm well pleased with what we are getting from them. Stephen Gray says, talking Kalamazoo, what about the Heritage Guitar Company? Well, Heritage is operating in the old Gibson building on Parsons Street. When Gibson closed down, the building didn't get torn down. The big smokestack still says Gibson on it. And Kalamazoo is the original home of Gibson. It is now the home of Heritage Guitars. And Heritage is now owned by owners out of, I believe, Singapore. And, but they've done quite a bit to work on the tooling and keep the quality up, making them in Kalamazoo, and they're producing a good instrument. Is it better than a Gibson? In my opinion, nope. Does it come up with quality that's similar? I'd say that the quality of the Kalamazoo's is, of the Kalamazoo-made heritage is probably pretty similar to what Gibson may have been doing late 70s and 80s, similar type of workmanship and basic tooling. Although they're investing in better tooling now, so we'll have to see what happens there. And it comes right down to it. The Kalamazoo Company heritage is capable of making a good guitar. These pictures of this Regal.
Yeah, it was on the other list.
We have somebody who has asked about a Regal guitar. Here we go. Mark says, I have a late 1930s Regal-made guitar that is identical in shape and size to those sold by Tonk Brothers. It's Washburn's Regal-branded slope-shoulder jumbos and Montgomery Ward Recording King jumbo, but this one has Bacon a Day Senorita peghead label. I believe Regal is selling these same basic model guitar to many retailers. Have I seen D&Ds like this? Well, I can hold up a picture and there be his photo. And this one doesn't look pre-war from what I can see. That peghead veneer looks more like some that were done as late as in the 60s. I've seen Gretsch banjos that had that type pearloid. That doesn't look like 1930s pearloid. But I have seen other Regals, like this picture right here of the Washburn slope shoulders. That looks old. And the body on this one, well, you've already seen it. I can't date it very well from this particular set of photos, but I can say that yes, there were instruments that were made by Regal for Gretsch. Gretsch was acquired Bacon. The Senorita name is a Bacon brand, but Bacon banjos was sold to Gretsch in the very late 30s. And there were Regal-made Gretsch instruments for Gretsch, where they contracted with Gretsch to make Bacon instruments and guitars. And John Fahey played a guitar like that. So that there are, I'd need to see more pictures, but there definitely are indeed Gretsch brand instruments, including a Senorita model that were made for Gretsch by Regal after Gretsch had acquired the Bacon Day brand. And that pretty much gets us to a point where I can sign off for this week. And I'll look forward to seeing you a week from now, Friday, and look forward to more questions, which hopefully I'll have answers. But till then, have a good one.